So our last speaker is Patricia García. She's currently a PhD candidate in gender and sexuality studies at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, pursuing her doctorate in the research of American lesbian literature in the second half of the 20th century. While conducting her research, she holds a position as English professor at CEU San Pablo University in Madrid, Spain, as well as collaborating designing language courses for Utah University in the same city. She graduated from English Studies at the University of the Basque Country in the class of 2016 and has since then earned 2 master's degrees, one in teaching, in which she has developed her professional career, and the other one in Anglo-American literature, thanks to which she has been able to develop her research career. In the last few years, Patricia has been granted a Fulbright grant to teach in the US, specifically in the Salve Regina University in Newport, Richmond, RI, which allowed her to present her work in international conferences in the US and Europe.
The thing is, I just needed it for you to see book covers and stuff, but truly, I don't think that or like to follow quotes, but I'm not really sure that it's going to be super needed. Oh, well, there we go. Well, it says maybe switch displays. Yeah, there we go. Cool. Figured it out. Oh, didn't. Look, I arrived late. I'm not going to keep you guys here, so let's just get started. Thank you. It was in Rhode Island that I was in the U.S. That was the. Yeah. Sorry, I should have gone over that. Well, so basically, well, first of all, thank you for the lectures. I'm sure that is going to give us a lot of food for thought. And I'm going to be talking about the West in a different way. I'm going to be seeing how the idea of the West has transformed as I've been seeing it in the lesbian community, and mostly in the lesbian narratives that I've been reading for my research. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to explain what are the ideas of this is so funny, the ideas that I want to present from the West, and more like a literary concept of a place. And so, as you will see in the PowerPoint, I will show you what are the ideas and what are the historical facts that actually lead to these ideas and that I want to take from this. Yeah. So then I will go and see why. I will try to explain why I think that New York City has had what I've called the lesbian migration, and then I will look at that in terms of movement, which is closely related to the West, clearly, to their safety, and also to their independence. Yeah? And then very quickly, I will draw some conclusions. Like I said, I want to keep you. So like I was saying, take a quick picture. This is what I wanted to explain. Yeah. So for the LGBT community, New York City has been a key setting, even before the Stonewall riots in the West Village, which set a precedent for queer rights. And my point here is that New York City has been repeatedly used in these lesbian narratives, as the place where there's promise of prosperity, and and said promise is equal to every person who dares to seek it. So I'm going to be looking at different novels, but I will get into that later. So the first idea that I want to, if you see the yellow things, those are the ideas that I want to extract from specific historical events that I want to exploit for this concept. So say the Homestead Act, 1862, the Manifest Destiny, or the Gold Rush. So Manifest Destiny, for example, mainly influenced the settler duty. It was like a periodical thing that you might have heard about that influenced the settler duty to expand. Yeah, the U.S. was a baby country, and so then they have this patriotic need to go west and see what's there. And this deeply ingrained in the American ideology forever. And then we have, so for me, this manifest destiny for me in literature transbased into the self-made man, I'll tell you, is the self-made man, which also transbases into the lesbian narratives that I will be looking into later. The Homestead Act, which was an act that allowed you to own any piece of land of the West that you would exploit and build a home in. There are many nuances to this, but well, mostly. And this kind of like pushed as well this hope and this endless possibilities ideal that we see in literature in the West. But there's something that ultimately actually allows people to move forward, right? Because you can dream and you can think about it, but then there's one thing that really pushes you to do stuff, which is money, or having the means and having the money to actually move. In this context, it's hope for independence, and it's what drives people in the gold rush to California. Yeah. So literary conventions built around these historical facts, which is what preserved this go west mindset. So this seems all like really cool. It seems almost like there's no catch, you know. But there was one catch, and that is women. What was the role of women here, and was this go west? This go west mindset, was it available for women? I'm sorry. So I won't go too much into gender because I know that we've had other lectures in this conference that talked about women in the West, and it was really interesting. But I do want to go into the concept of masculinity, and is that when women did start going to the West, because there was virtually a very historically a lack of women in this settling that people did in the westward expansion, their role was to actually tame the West, bring civilization from the East or from the settler duty, bring civility in. And civilization and civility is seen, and Theodore Roosevelt, the president, did a speech about this. For the West, it was seen as an obstacle. It was seen as a negative thing to civilize the West, because it was a feminine thing. It was women coming in and setting up charities, or making sure that people would go to church, and all of these things, they were seen as feminine. So these women were known as gentle tamers. And they were mystified in literature. So the role of the woman exists in Western literature, and it does, and it's mystified to a way, and I'm quoting, approaching sainthood. And you're like, well, this is good, right? Because women are glorified. But this is not good, because if you glorify the powerlessness that women had, this idea in literature grips society, and eventually becomes the way that women have to behave, and like the ideal of women, right? Yeah, so it represents the personification of desired national characteristics, and I'm quoting, "Yet the very masculine qualities of the Western hero embodies the qualities that prove unsustainable and socially unviable." This is a quote relating to why women were brought to the West, or were actually the West was made more appealing to them because they had a role now. Anyway, so now we have this role for women. So my point was, these women, imagine that there's a woman who, is out of the box. Yeah, there were women who, of course, there were women in Western literature as well, who were cool and were cowgirls and all of this, but I won't get into this because we don't have that much time. But women who step out of the box basically are winning at being men. Yeah, they're another version of a man. So again, we have this villainization of femininity as something negative, and you're only valid as a woman if you're acting like a man. So let's say that if we have all of these concepts, this literature doesn't work for lesbian women, does it? There's no place for development. There's no place for an actual space for queer women in this literature. lesbian women could not go west to find something better, yeah, to find this feeling of hope that we were talking about before. I'm just amazed at this, is because I'm seeing it in the reflection. So women do not have this opportunity to go west. So what do? Well, they find a new west, yeah. For me, this new west is New York City. And I'm gonna dive into why. And now I'm gonna introduce the 4 novels that I'm going to be, diving into, again, really quickly. The first one is The Price of Salt. You might know it as Carol, published 1952. Patricia Highsmith is kind of like the first. It's categorized as the first happy ending lesbian novel, but I have many comments about that. I will go into the 1950s again with Odd Girl Out by Anne Bannon, and for me this sets a huge precedent. It's a step forward in lesbian literature because it overcomes the shame with which the lesbian identity has extended in literature up until today. So that's one. And then a landmark, moving forward in history, a landmark of lesbian literature is Ruby Fruit Jungle by Rita Mae Brown. And I could have selected works from the 80s and the 90s, but truly I just wanted to show how in history, if we jump up until today, we can still see this eastward migration of queer women. So I'm gonna be looking at One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston, a bestseller of 2020. So the first thing that I will talk about other books, but these are the main ones that I wanted to have in mind. So the first concept that I want to look at is the concept of movement, which is tightly wound with the West and with this idea of moving forward. Yeah, so there needs to be movement for the concept of the West to work. Yeah, the characters normally in these novels, they're in search for a moment and a location where they can construct their identity. And this is oftentimes represented by a change of setting, yeah? There's very little room for development in the original setting, of the novels. And this is shown through how characters, are really stuck until they do leave their original setting. Let's take Ruby Fruit Jungle, for example, who's not welcome in her family, and she lacks economic and cultural resources for anything new, anything other than what she's had. And so she decides to go to New York. Spoiler alert, all of these people go to New York. And so she goes to New York, and this joins with the self-made man concept that we were also talking about before. She has no means to do anything. She just moves and starts from scratch. So we have the self-made man concept of the West, and also this signifies a kind of queer rebirth. Yeah, we see her start from zero and construct her real identity. So there's no Molly Bolt, the protagonist of Ruby Fruit Jungle, without New York. And there's no other place for her to be, yeah? There's a quote here from the book, and it says, "There are so many queers in New York that one more wouldn't rock the boat." Yeah, so that's the place that I'm going to go. She lived in Florida. She could have gone anywhere. She could have gone to Chicago. She could have gone to San Francisco, but she chose New York, yeah? And this is recurrent in all of the novels that I've been reading, where there's an extrapolation of the character. Let's go to Anne Bannon, for example, who, like I said, set a precedent in 1957 with Odd Girl Out, in the way in which her character presents her lesbian identity without any shame. This is huge. This is huge. I don't know if you are familiar with lesbian narratives, but they're all really shameful. Yeah. So other works before Americans, of course, had presented lesbian identities, even before The Price of Salt, but of course, it was very, very shameful. But we have this Odd Girl Out, the character of Laura, who decides to move to New York after she has been discovered with her lover, and she says, and I quote, "I know what I am, and I can be honest with myself now. I live my life as honestly as I can without ruining it." And she says, "I can't do that here." and I can do it with you. So it means that there's a lesbian migration eastwards. Yeah, there's no way for the characters to stay in their own, in the original setting of the novel, and keep on exploring their identities and building an identity. Yeah. This is repeated as well in The Price of Salt. Like I said, you might know it as Carol. Therese Belivet just pops up in New York. We don't know anything about her before that. So that means that she basically didn't have an identity before she got to New York. Yeah. And that's when she starts becoming herself and letting herself go, other than by her lesbian identity, but most like other stuff as well. This is where she meets Carol, and this she only can do in New York. Yeah. But there's an interesting twist here with the West, and the concept of the West is when the two lovers, Carol and Therese, they go on a 2-week trip to the West because they want to get out of the city. That's when they reach their highest level of intimacy, meaning that the West seems to be still symbolizing this liberatory place where you can do anything, you can go anywhere. And it would have been beautiful to see that in The Price of Salt. But then, as soon as the two lovers reach their highest level of intimacy, they have sex. This is when the narrative plants the poison of the West. Yeah, so kind of basically, Carol has been fighting for the whole novel for the full custody of her daughter, Rindy, because she recently divorced her husband. And this point in the narrative, when they're West, is when a private investigator finally manages to record the two lovers together, and that is the final evidence that serves in court so that she loses the custody of her daughter. This is why I was like, well, happy ending, okay. And then, so basically, even though the West seems to have this liberatory capacity, Patricia Highsmith already seems to be pointing that lesbians cannot do that there. Yeah, it might be liberatory, but it's not for me. The place where they finally get their happy ending, quote unquote, is New York. Yeah, so it would have been liberatory, but if they had ended up all right, but they didn't. Let's look at today, because you might say, well, this happened a long time ago. But let's go and look at a narrative that was published 2020. It was a bestseller as well, One Last Stop. This happens again, kind of, yeah. The protagonist, August Laundrie, she defends the power of New York City to house queer women, since both protagonists of the novel move from the western side of the country to New York, yeah, and it's very interesting. Even the protagonist even grew up in San Francisco, so which is another of the great cities for queer liberation. But the narrative moves her to New York, which is the place where she finally can, seems to finally connect with her personality and with who she is. And this is established in the very first lines of the novel, because she's looking for an apartment, and she finds an ad that's very queer friendly. Other modern works have also perpetrated this idea of the West as a poisoned place for lesbian identity. I don't know if you've read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, but it was a 2017 bestseller. It's an absolute marvel. You should get it. And the narrative develops in California because Evelyn Hugo is a famous actress, blah, blah. And the only time in her queer relationship where she is living a happy life, let's say it like this, it's when the couple is in New York. So the entire relationship with her and Celia St. James happens in California, Los Angeles, but the relationship is very tumultuous until they have a period of their lives when they have a flat in the Upper East Side, and they're really happy. Yeah, that's when their identity as queer women really comes to life. So you might say, like, okay, but why do they go to New York? Oh, sorry. Well, you have a quote here. What is it about New York City that is making all of these lesbians migrate in these narratives, yeah? Well, the West Village in New York City serves in this literature the part that the western part of America did for Eastern families going to find this hope and this opportunity many times. And this is because queers in New York City, or the West Village, and these neighborhoods with a more queer scene, they were allowed to exist, basically. Yeah? And to use the verb allowed to describe the situation might seem a little bit extreme, but the truth is that the LGBT community in the second half of the 20th century they were gathering with organizations and like maybe underground clubs and all of this. Well, lesbian organizations are non-existent, only gay ones, but bars were very easily raided by the police, so they started to join other minority activist organizations instead. And it's not that the city or the New York Police Department didn't have laws against the practice of homosexuality, or they were okay with it, or they did not condemn homosexual practices, which they did, and they did raid bars and they did incarcerate gays. But the city had an underground agreement to let them be, unless it was completely necessary to not let them be, yeah? If you look at this quote, well, finally, this is what I've been saying. If you look at this quote, for example, it says, although police and law enforcement agencies frequently kept records on suspected homosexuals, they often adopted a policy of ignoring these files, yeah, except when it was convenient to do so. So New York actually is a safer place for people. This wouldn't happen in Minnesota, would it? Yeah, if a police officer catches you in Minnesota, it's not the same effect. So, so safety is a big issue, and it's more or less better seen in New York for the queer scene. And the last thing that I want to stop in is the independence. Of course, we're talking about queer people. We're talking about queer women. And women cannot develop an identity if they're not married, especially depending on in which era. So in New York City was a friendlier place for women to find, for single women to find a job and actually, start building a life, take care of their own expenses, although, of course, it was limited to certain areas of works. But finding economic independence without having to be monitored by a man is exactly the same thought that anyone moving to a hopeful West would have had, yeah? Obviously, a woman cannot move west, and yesterday there was a lecture talking about the safety that women who decided to just get out of their Western community, they wouldn't have the same safety as a man moving out of their community, right? So it's the same with women. Women could not go west, but if they went east and they went to New York, they could actually find a job that paid their rent, and they could actually start mingling with whatever scene they wanted in the West Village, yeah? So, yeah, like I say in the PowerPoint, women were not semi-free to make decisions until the late 1970s. Lesbians existed before the 1970s. And lesbians were going to New York before this as well, yeah? So let's conclude really quickly. All of the lesbian characters flee to New York City from the 1950s on in lesbian narratives to be able to construct their identity. And not only for identity as well, but also for safety, economic independence. New York City serves as the new West for the lesbian community that is found in the literary world, and migration has a role to play in both recent best-selling novels, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo and One Last Stop, as we have seen. The first one makes a case of the first time the protagonist was allowed to be happy in her lesbian relationship once she settles in the city, in the Upper East Side. And August flees San Francisco, flees the West to New York City as the place where she can finally find herself. After many years not knowing what she was lacking, yeah? And all of these instances show how important the city and and the lesbian scene is, whether it was in undercover clubs, activist groups, or various minorities in the privacy of their apartment. But in any case, New York City becomes the lesbian West. And that's all from me.
Oh, well, that was wonderful. I have read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and I never noticed that, but from now on, I'm going to keep my eye out for that. Okay, so now we come to questions. Oh, there's a question there at the back.
Thank you. So, well, good morning, and thank you for your wonderful presentations. I have one question for Patricia, and it's, well, you had a limited amount of time to present your analysis, but I was wondering if you've considered class issues or socioeconomic status for your analysis. I was wondering, because you mentioned San Francisco, New York, I was wondering whether you will explore or have explored the connotations in terms of class that these places may have, or the differences that the places they come from and they go to may have in terms of class, whether social mobility is involved, and also whether you've analyzed the possible differences in terms of class of both the characters and the authors, or differences in terms of other social parameters that may have an impact in that migration and that movement that you mentioned.
Yeah, well, definitely class is something to take into account every time. And what's curious with all these characters that I've mentioned, and there are more, but is that across class, there's always the same need for movement. Take into account that in the queer scene is a bit different, because regardless of what your background is, many times families reject these characters, and so the characters, they might get their educational and social status withdrawn in the bat of an eye. So class is definitely something to take into account, but sometimes they start always from scratch. This is also seen in Root Fruit Jungle that I mentioned. Regardless of what she has been doing her entire life, suddenly she's kicked out, and so she has to start from scratch. So definitely it's very precarious, and the queer women who move and who actually manage to keep some of this status or economic reasons, it's because they managed well to hide their identity and develop this identity in the privacy of the home, which is also very common for lesbian women, and is different for gay men who are not that able to develop in the home. So yeah, but I will keep an eye out for class. It's a very interesting remark. Yeah.
Thank you also for the recommendations.
I have a comment on your presentation, Patricia. It was very interesting. First of all, I have a question. Is The Price of Salt came out with Tilda Swinton also as Carol, the movie?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so that's why I wanted to make sure. Yeah, and the other thing is, I would say that your comment at the end that the lesbian women needs to be independent. I would say that any woman has to be independent, right? I mean, because there is no difference between a man and a woman, so every woman has to be independent.
Yeah.
Not only somebody who is gay, but I mean also, or lesbian, but any women. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. Thank you. Sometimes I'm so ingrained in the lesbian scene that but yeah, any woman needs to be independent. But yes. What I meant is, and Virginia Woolf already said that, but especially these women who need to become something outside of the norm. If they're going to try and live outside of the norm, it's very, very important for them to have their own income. But of course,
for every woman, in order to develop your identity, right?
Every woman is living outside of the norm, actually. So that's fine. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. And I have a question for Ariadna. Ariadna, can you elaborate a little bit more on this more liberal culture that Sterling found in San Francisco?
Yes.
Yeah, we're on.
Well, I say that he found a more liberal culture in San Francisco, just because he lived in Sag Harbor, and as it was such a small town there in New York, and also it was a town in the range of, well, in the scope of action of the revivalist of the Second Great Awakening of Calvinism, you know.
Okay.
It was, well, the population was really attached to conservative values and conservative moral conventions, and he wasn't, well, he didn't feel identified with those conventions, but for example, with nature, he preferred to go on a walk into the forest or go to the beach rather than go to church and keep to, well, the moral conventions, as I said. And then when he went to San Francisco, he met a lot of authors and a lot of artists that showed him that it was possible to have a life, well, a different life, according to that pursuit of beauty, of pleasure, with which he felt more identified.
Okay. One more question. I don't know Sterling at all, but did he find God in nature somehow in his poems? I mean, does it come through that, or?
Not really, but because he was more attached to a naturalistic and pessimistic way of seeing life. So he mixed somehow transcendentalism. So we can say that he finds God in nature, but it's not God, it's beauty. You know, beauty becomes his God.
Okay.
Okay.
Very good.
Okay. Just one last question.
Yeah, thank you so much for your wonderful presentations. I have, well, I had questions for every one of you, but I'll stick now to Flavia. Flavia, thank you so much. Of course, I don't know this Italian author, but I was quite curious because, I mean, particularly because of the dedication, not the dedication, but the epigraph by Cormac McCarthy. So I suppose that this author, Matteo Brighetto, yeah, so he's aware. I mean, he knows American literature. I mean, you have the novel, of course, but
well,
I mean, he's.
Sorry.
Yeah, I know.
Well, Righetto, at the beginning of his career, he founded a literary movement that was called Sugar Pop. Okay, so he was a fanatic. He's a fanatic of American literature, and I have a note, but I didn't, put it in. It's in my notes, but. In Sugar Pop, he said that it was time to revive Italian literature. Stuffy, because we have had for so many decades Moravia's novels, so introspection, complicated character and so on. And he said that, it's time for the author to become like the new American realist, like Lansdale, McCormack, McCarthy, so, and other people that he is mentioning. And then he even writes 10 rules that a writer should respect. And so he wants to look at reality, and he thinks that Italians should look at their own reality, as he did in his novels, right, to a certain extent. But at the beginning, during this phase in which he is looking at the American neo-realist, in his opinion, so he thinks that we should look at reality. And in fact, his first novel, like, they all have to do, most of them, with the mountains, but the very first one during this period in which he was a member that eventually left the group, and if you search it on the internet, you can find the Sugar Pop, and it was a bunch of young writers. He also wrote a novel that is Padana, Po Valley, Savannah, and Bucaglione Blues, that talks about they're gangster stories, but they're set in the Veneto. They speak dialect, these gangsters, you know. So they are gangsters in quote. They are, you know, bad guys, people that, you know, as we say in Italian, it's better to lose than to find. But they're local. They live in villages, in a rural area, you know. And so he had this idea. But then eventually I think that he found his own voice.
Yeah.
And I think these novels that they deal with the mountains are really where the best of him comes out.
Yeah, because even the dedication, it reminds me of transcendentalist. It's a transcendentalist idea, you know, the poet, the seer, whatever. Okay, thank you very much. But I will just have a note. You know, you said that the difference with the classic American Western is that the American hero finds or gives regeneration using violence. But I remind you of Shane, because Shane uses violence, but he also does it for the love of the family.
Right.
Because he loves the family.
That is
See
not
what I mean?
his family. Yeah,
So Shane is a kind of, it's a model for the
yeah.
a certain American cowboy. So of course he uses violence. He leaves his, let's say, and the future for the community, but particularly for the family and the love of the
For the
family,
love
or
of the
even
boy
of
and
the
the
woman, but
yes,
that's
and the
something else.
woman, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Thank you very much to all our speakers and the audience. This is the end of this panel. If you are interested, there is right now in the Aula Magna a plenary lecture by Susan Bernardine from Oregon State University called Remembering into the Future, Gender and the American West. Thank you for coming.
Oh.